Okay, so we've talked about the first domain, the cognitive domain, and what's required in that. We looked at just some of that. You can imagine the amount of information and data in that space is staggering. And this, unfortunately, this presentation will not give us time to do that. But now I want to move on to the second thing we need, second key arena we need to engage in if we're going to shift culture away from the permissiveness of drug use towards a prevention model. And that is the affective domain. Now, this is a key domain. And this is the one in our postmodern relativist culture most difficult to engage in, but the one we need to if we're going to develop true cultural and personal resiliency in our society. Check out this clip. Now, some of you laughed, and as you heard the audience watching the clip laughed. And I get it, it's kind of bizarre. You know, this truck backs over a guy, and it's a shocking event. We laugh, we sort of respond that way. But what I think that clip is incredibly profound. And I think it's actually a wonderful snapshot of the current postmodern culture. Here's a guy who's comfortable, he's asleep, he doesn't want to be disturbed. I just want to feel okay about where I am right now. And then an alarm goes off, starts beeping in his ears, beep, beep. So what he does what he normally does. Okay, I know what that is. I know what this problem is. I'm going to fix it. I'm going to turn that off. So he hits it to try and turn the alarm off. Doesn't go off. So keeps going. So he goes, oh. So he repeats the same exercise. Doesn't go off. Guess what? Repeats it again. So in the old definition, what's the definition of insanity? Doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result. So he's done the same thing 3 times, doesn't stop the alarm. So he thinks, okay, not a problem. I'm just going to cover my head, block my ears, and pretend it's not there. And then he gets backed over by a truck. I think the emerging generation is in that place right now, and we have helped make that bed that they're lying in. Sure, they have choices, and we need to enable them to make better choices. Really, really important. So choice does matter. Famous author Stephen Covey said this: "In between stimulus and response is the greatest power you have. The power to choose." But our capacity to choose well is being diminished every day, particularly for our young people. But what is influencing your choice? That's a key issue. That's the idea of propaganda, of creating a bubble, as it were, creating a frame that's limiting information, driving the same points over, feeding it with peer solidarity and media affirmations. So the kid, the emerging adult, is developed or framed in this really narrow one-dimensional space. And they're told that this is what's real. And so our capacity to make choice is also geared to what we're aware of. There's an old adage: what you're aware of, you can control, but what you're not aware of controls you. And we've got a generation emerging that's not aware of a great deal because it's not been equipped to do that. And if we're not aware of what we really need to do, all that we need to do to make smart choices, wise choices, us and community benefiting choices, so it's not just about me and mine, it's about us and we. If we don't do that, then all we're doing is end up likely, we don't make decisions, but the decisions make us. And with substance use, you see it all the time. Once those decisions are made, that usually, from that point on, the decisions are making that person. They're not making choices anymore. They'll tell you they are. Most addicts, the most dependent people and addicts do. I'm in control, I'm okay, I don't have a problem with this. And every time they step back in that same cauldron, that same crucible. And it's disturbing. And then there, of course, with our permissive language, we tell them it's okay, and we've been through that already. But Shane, you don't get it. Teenagers are going to rebel. You can't stop it. You just have to manage the damage. That's what we're going to do. Now, understand, ladies and gentlemen, understand that adolescence is actually a 20th century construct. It was a new construct, and I've touched on this before. But this is something that we've created. In other words, this new space where when a child hits, prepubescent child hits puberty, from that point on to the time that they're so-called a full adult, there's this period called adolescence. And that's kind of an experimental, out of control, rebellious time. Now again, those mantras are snuck into our culture. And not until basically the 1940s and 50s was that any real in our culture. That didn't exist. We had children who went through rites of passage, were given responsibility, became adults. But now we've created this playing field. And now adolescence can start at 10 and last as long as to your 70. I mean, Mick Jagger's still singing, I can't get no satisfaction at 75. The reality is there's this kind of play space. And of course in our first world West, with recreation, disposable income, is so powerful. These are drivers that also add to that problem, add to that space. The brain's going through its second most important stage of development and maturation. The first stage is between the ages of about 1 and 4, 1 and 5. That's when the brain gets to its full physical size. And what happens in that stage of life is incredibly important. And the imprints on that little brain for children is just, it cannot be overstated how important that is. Hence, when a child is born to a drug-addicted mother, in a drug-using or alcohol-abusing family, and the impact that can be on that child and the impression on that child's brain sets it up for life. But that's, again, another story for another day. But the second most important phase is when you hit puberty. It lasts between 7 and 10 years, depending on the individual. And that point of that developmental phase of the brain is absolutely imperative. And all the evidence is in. There is no such thing as any safe drug use, legal or illegal drug use, for the developing brain. Every drink, every substance will do some measure of damage. Look, it may be minute, arguably. One drink, maybe just, but it will do some damage. We know that from the evidence. Yet we keep hearing from pro-drug advocates that there is safer drug use. Abstinence at this space is the best practice. Evidence-based best practice for the developing brain is not to use substances at all. No argument for me that people are going to use it and there's all sorts of drive. I know that. But let's not negate the evidence. Let's not ignore that fact just because people are going to do it. Again, that just buys into that whole permissibility culture, that whole mantra of, this is normal behaviour. Social sciences attempted then to define the psychological factors and motivated behaviour. They concluded that the brain was in a transitional phase that needed to experiment and rebel in finding its adult identity. That was one theory that emerged that kind of took root. So again, the language tells you, it's normal to rebel, it's normal to experiment, it's normal to fight against your authorities. Okay, and all a parent can do is manage that. Now again, it's a theory, it's an idea, it's a concept. And it's unfortunately taken root by some people. That evokes an abdication. I can't do much about it, so hopefully they don't take too many drugs and hopefully they don't do crime and hopefully they don't kill themselves. At least I put food on the table and that's all I can do. That kind of, I get where that can emerge from, but that couldn't be further from the truth. Rebellion and reward are very, very interesting dynamics in the developing brain. And the reward factor is a key element, and that's what neuroscientists are now finding. The reward element in the brain is vital, and that being met is really, really key. So is it rebellion or is it reward? The way the brain development chemistry is engaged will determine whether the emerging adult is rebellious or not. How we've been designed and our wired is remarkable. The byplay with family, values, behaviours, acceptable, not acceptable, structures, discipline, motivators, relationships, healthy or unhealthy, brain development together, and epigenetics work together like a recipe to develop that unique human being. They all work together. Now, of course, those things have different elements. They can be missing. They can be too much or too little of either of some of those. It'll create that. But there's not this rebellious idea. Rebellion is not a foregone conclusion. If those things are done well, then the brain experiences reward. If the brain and body is engaged properly with exploration, not just experimentation, in what for functional civil societies is considered good, right and true, then the reward center of the brain and gene expression is less likely to experiment with substances. So it's still potential to do that. But what we're saying here, you see what's happening? We've got a shift of paradigm. We've got two directions we can go here, but we're not been told that. We've been told this is what's going to happen. No. Science is making that clear. There's definitely both options on the table, but it's all about how that's engaged. Culturally, familiarly, as well as environmentally, biologically, all those things matter. Children were not meant to grow themselves up and just do whatever they want to do and emerge. That's not how it works. We know that from the evidence. Now, experimentation or exploration. Let's look at the science here. One experiment that bears out this principle was tabled by Naito, as you can see up on the screen there. A history of adolescent alcohol use. The developing brain is drinking alcohol. When there's a history of that, it alters the dopamine signaling to risk and not reward. The very important distinction there. Thus, a corruption of cost encoding suggests that adolescent alcohol use leads to long-term changes in decision making by altering the valuation of risk. So the brain is built for reward, and so it looks for good reward, satisfaction, fulfillment, meaning, direction, purpose, healthy family relationships, being loved, significance, identity. Those things are imperative for the emerging adult to experience healthily and wisely and well. But when they're not, right, and they introduce a substance during this adolescent or developmental brain phase, the encoding of the brain says, oh, this is fun, this is good, push the button, I'm liking this. The reward button gets pushed, but it's pushed in a lazy way. I don't need to work for this, I just need to do that, take that. The vicissitudes of life. Take that. Chemical timeout. Take that. I feel good. Straight away. Shortcut. But what it also does is it then, with this developing brain, says, oh, there's not much risk. The perception of risk diminishes. So taking a drug, a substance, is a good thing and it's rewarding. The risks behind it are low. That's what's going on biochemically in the brain without any other cultural cues. So you see what's happening when the cultural cues and the substance taking at that adolescent age really sets up young people to fail miserably moving forward. Now, they may not fail, but the chances of failure and the risks for failure are exponentially greater when substances are involved in that process. The Gottman scale. Alcohol now has been seen as the gateway drug for teenagers. Not cannabis, but alcohol. Alcohol represented the gateway drug, leading to the use of tobacco, marijuana, and then other illicit drugs. Moreover, students who used alcohol exhibited a significantly greater likelihood of using both illicit and licit drugs. That's disturbing. Also, to add to that, Judge Roger Dive of the Parramatta Drug Court here in Australia made this statement quite a few years ago. He said this, I've never met a heroin addict yet who didn't start with alcohol and then cannabis. So again, you can see all these factors working together, folks. And this is why we need to shift culture. This is why prevention needs to be holistic. It can't be just tell them don't do drugs. We need to, as a community, to get behind this, not just sit there and abdicate from responsibility or let people who are dangerous simply get their message out and no one else gets to have a say. Further evidence. Self-control protects urban minority youths from drug use and depression mood. This was a longevity study done over 10 years in the US, and NIDA produced this. In a cohort of urban African Americans and Puerto Ricans, high levels of self-control at age 14, get this, were associated with low levels of both marijuana use and depressive mood up to the age of 29. In other words, a sense of resiliency in their 14-year-old, and according to their data, they're saying things like bolstering their ethnic and racial minority identity as children, self-control factors shield them from burdens of drug use and depression, saying when they're resilient at 14, 15 and they're not using substances, they can sensibly be drug-free right through to adulthood, even to 29. So again, resiliency is a key issue. Now, when kids aren't resilient, when culture's not resilient, again, we just want to medicate whatever we feel bad about. We just want to feel better. We don't know how to manage it. We don't know how to cope with it. We don't know how to develop through that. We simply want to feel better. And we're told it's your right to feel okay. It's your right to feel pleasure. It's your right not to feel pain. And those are the messages that are coming through to emerging young people. And that's why the use of legal pharmaceutical drugs is growing. Because they don't want any pain. I remember talking to a drug educator who went to a school. He was talking to young 14-year-old girls who would go through a packet of Nurofen a day. And they say, why? Is it are you having your period? No, we just take the drugs in case we feel pain. We just don't want that to start. So they take an entire packet of Nurofen during a day, just so they the possibility they might feel pain. Not that they needed to medicate pain, they just didn't want to feel it. That's just one story of dozens that I know of. Let's move into potential parent impact. And this is really important, guys. Parents, you have more influence on resiliency and development and growth and prevention, that's the key word here, than you know, and more than you're led to believe, which is really sad. Parental interest in learning, so in other words, if you show interest in your child's learning and development at school, is 4 times more important than social and economic factors, or even the quality of school in influencing attainment. If you think you're broke, you've got no money, your kids are going to an ordinary school, if you show real interest in and support of your child's learning, that's 4 times more likely to have benefit for them than the other 2 factors combined. Positive parenting protects against the risks associated with growing up in a poor and deprived neighbourhood. So you can be in a poor neighbourhood, terrible neighbourhood, but when you've got great parents who love their kids, who are proactive with them and supportive, those kids are actually remarkably strong for the most part. They don't get involved in illicit substances or crime or vandalism. Finally, children spend 75% of their time outside of school when peer and family influences are the greatest. So you have more time with your kids than you know if you choose to, and that's the key point. So these are just snapshots of some things that can be done. This particular study we look at here came out of the US. Dr. Bertha Madras put this together, and it's fascinating. Parents, their views, their help have enormous impact on drug use. For example, when parents disapprove of smoking and model disapproval, look at the reduction. The number of kids goes from 40% down to 10%. Parents do not disapprove, it's up at 40%. When it comes to marijuana, when parents disapprove of marijuana use and of course don't use it themselves, the use of marijuana goes from 30% down to about 9%. If they didn't help with homework, the illicit drug use was around 20%. When parents helped with homework, it was down below 10%. And of course with smoking, when parents helped with homework, kids were far less likely to smoke cigarettes. These are just some snapshots of realities that can make a difference. So again, you have a remarkable influence, but the culture, some of the data you're getting in the public arena doesn't reaffirm this, doesn't share this. And that's what needs to be out there. If we're going to shift culture, we've got to empower families and communities, and we do that through proper education, through media, through schools, through policy that reinforces these kind of things. So now the question I want to ask us as an audience, and it's a personal question and a reflective one, but it's an important one. Are you or we adding to demand, or are we reducing it? There's no fence sitting with this one, guys. We're either trying to reduce demand by engaging in some of the things we've looked at this evening, or we're actually adding to it. And passivity is adding to it. So modelling is really, really important. Culture and modelling. Etymologist Richard Eckersley, brilliant academic, wrote this. He said, young people have a particular vulnerability to the failure of what modern Western culture to do well what cultures are supposed to do. And what's that? Provide webs of meaning that shape the way people see the world, locate themselves in the world, and behave in it. Now that's buying back to what we talked about earlier about Resnick's commentary on cultural abuse. Eckersley's reflecting that again. That's the responsibility of community to do that. Now when we abdicate from that and just land on the individualistic frameworks, we're going to increase anxiety, we're going to increase depression, we're going to increase all those things that the vicissitudes of life will add to that need a chemical timeout. So to fix this, what we need to address, again, context, paradigm, the why. I said at the start of this session, why is the only real question we have to answer. Context is everything. So the paradigm, how a person sees the world, the old argument is, what do you see? So the answer to that question is you ask the next question, you step back and go, what are you looking at? But to answer that question, you have to go back one step further. It says, where are you standing? You see, folks, where you stand determines what you look at, and what you look at determines what you see. And that's why it's important to get the best context you can possibly get. And our society refuses to go back too far. We like just to, this is what I want to see, I choose to see this. But I don't want to go see other things that may have to change my perspective to find out it was good, right, true, what is best practice. That's something that we're not empowered to do in our culture. We need to be. Change our paradigm, the why. We've addressed at Delgado, there's 4 key areas that influence drug taking, if you like, the why. These are categories that we've identified that tend to mobilise or motivate kids into into substance use. The first one is relentless pain. The second one is relational poverty. The third one is recalcitrant hedonism. And of course, the last one is residing absurdity. Now, let me unpack those. So what are we doing, folks? Are we medicating or are we alleviating? This is really important. Now, Dr. Wodak said we are basically self-medicating. I would argue that we are doing that. We also are alleviating. We're trying to alleviate something. And we're doing it the wrong way. Because all it does is take a time out. We have to go back to the court of dysfunction again. Back to the court of problems again. Back to the game of stress. So to take a time out again, we have to go back to the chemical. Back. We're not actually addressing this. So first one, relentless pain. Let me tell you a quick story about a girl that we interviewed for our I Wish I'd Never DVD series. Her name's Michelle. Relentless pain was basically her world. Dysfunctional family, won't go into all the details, but at the age of about 9, she's sexually abused by a family member. What should not happen to an animal happens to her. That young life is forever marred as a result. She's at a party a little bit later on, and one of these relatives that gave her a couple of little drinks of scotch, and she got really tipsy quite quickly. And they thought it was funny to give her a whole lot more. So this 10-year-old girl gets wasted on whiskey, on spirits. From Michelle's own words, what happened for her during that was that as a little girl, not understanding her pain, not understanding what's happened to her, as you can imagine, a 9-year-old girl being so violated by a family member, someone who's supposed to love and nurture them. And then she's given a substance. And all she knows is when I had that, I felt yucky afterwards, but when I had it, I felt okay. I felt good. The message got through. I've got pain. This makes me feel better. She can't articulate this as a 9-year-old, but when she has this stuff, she feels better. She had no supports, whatnot. She goes to high school, and of course she's been sexualised in the worst kind of way so young. She hits puberty very early. So in high school, she's the well-developed girl at a young age. Long story short, an older girl in the school picks up with her and notices that she's rebellious and hardcore and gets her involved in cannabis. And then after a while, this older girl says to her, listen, this is expensive stuff. I know how to make money. Boys like us, they'll pay for sex. Over the next 5, 6, 7 years, she transitioned into basically full-blown prostitution just to deal with her habit. She'd take heroin during the day to sleep, and she'd take amphetamines at night to function as a prostitute. So you can see the cycle. Now, she wanted to get off this, and she found it was really tough for her, and pharmacotherapy was really helpful for her. She went through naltrexone, which was incredibly useful for her. But the upshot of that is she's off the drugs. She wants to get pregnant. She just wants to be a mum. That's their big, I want to be a mum. I just long to be a mum. She's had 5 pregnancies. 4 of them failed. They all self-terminated. And she had one little baby. She was so excited, but that baby was so congenitally deformed, so damaged because of her drug use, that after several operations and everything the doctors could do to save it, and her longing for that baby to be saved, it died in a matter of weeks. She was shattered. And you can imagine where that drove her to. I want to go back to the drugs. I just want to feel okay again. I get that. That's a nightmare. I don't condone that. But I totally understand her need. I totally understand the pain that screams out, I just want to feel better. But the majority of young people who take up drugs, that's not their story. The vast majority, that's not their story. Remember, it's peer pressure and curiosity. The second one we've identified is relational poverty. Now, this is really interesting. We are arguably the most connected generation that's ever lived on the planet. But real engagement and authentic non-sexual intimacy is vanishing. We're a sexualized culture and we're online. We hook up. We don't actually engage. So we're more connected than ever, but less connected than ever. One study done in Australia is around 1,000 Year 10 students, or 15-year-olds, were surveyed. They were asked what was the most useful thing for them to help them prevent them from getting involved in destructive behaviours, like, drug use, crime, and even promiscuity, the things that, self-harm. 87% of this quite significant sample said the thing that they needed the most to help them not do those things was the involvement of an older, significant other in their world who cared about them. Now, that may not be apparent. It should be apparent. We know that's not always the case, and that's why I have mentors. My children, we get on incredibly well, but they had mentors, encouraged them to have mentors. And they had other young adults that were functional and helpful and were caring for their well-being, be able to speak into their lives and help them through issues that they perhaps couldn't talk to their parents about. Fantastic. That's what community's supposed to do. Look after each other. Come on, let's talk about this. Let's work through this. Let's try and find a positive way forward. Sure, let's talk about this. So relational poverty is a real driver. And again, that buys into the peer pressure and the curiosity thing. Now, the third thing, which I think is interesting, that we've identified to see are we medicating or are we alleviating, is what we call the residing absurdity. Now, this is quite a complex area, but I think it's very, very profound and worthwhile our broaching here. I like to tell the story about Helen Keller. Now, most in the room know who Helen Keller is? Yeah? Some of you guys do? Yeah, sure. Helen Keller was the woman who basically invented Braille. Now, that's a remarkable thing, but you've got to understand the story behind Helen Keller. Helen Keller was born deaf, dumb and blind in an era where there was no technology, no educational formats, and no processes to help her learn. So how does she learn? She's deaf, dumb and blind. She's born into basically an aristocratic family. Her dad was a high-level army colonel. Mum was kind of a society lady, quite wealthy. Mum, being a nursery mum, loved her daughter, but the daughter was, to use their terms, out of control. She just grunted, kicked things, acted out, and understandably, she doesn't have any other way to understand. You can't communicate with her, and she can't communicate with you. And when you haven't got that open, communicatable relationship, what happens to the child? It acts out. She's worked out, she bangs the table to get food, and she screams that she wants to go to the toilet, like a little baby. Just squawks and makes a mess. Squawks and makes a mess. Dad wants to put her away because he says, I can't deal with this. This is a nightmare. Just put her in an institution somewhere and let her bang her head against a wall, basically. Mum says, we can't do that. Anyway, long story short, into the scene comes a woman by the name of Annie Sullivan. Here's an older significant other, right, who comes in, who works with Helen. Now, the journey goes on, and I'm going to skip a few years ahead. She teaches her how to behave by just giving her basic instructions. Things like putting a hat on her head. And she knew that when she put a hat on her head, that meant we're going outside. She taught her how to sit at a table, how to eat, how to do basic signalling to get things. Like rather than bang the table, she puts her hand up and things like that. I'm speculating here, but she gave her basic skills to engage with her environment. But Helen Keller actually tells the story herself of the day the lights came on for her. She went outside. She knew she was going outside because the hat went on her head. So cue, I'm going outside. So the language, the communication is now set up. We have a language that we can now communicate. So she's aware of what's happening next. She's not insecure. She knows what's coming next, right? They go outside. It's a warm day, she says. And then Annie takes her over to the water pump. She knows it's the water pump because this thing makes noises and that this wet stuff comes that she drinks. And she's learnt that's water. She learns that's for thirst. But she didn't know what it was called. So what Annie did for the first time was put her hand into the stream of the water and with her hand wrote the words W-A-T-E-R. She did it several times and gave her the cue, that's water. Now, she can't hear that because she's deaf, no? Blind and dumb. Now, Helen Keller says in her book, she says, that's when the lights come on. For the first time, I understood. I had a context. That wet stuff is called water. Item, language, understanding, meaning. This makes sense. And then from that point on, she learned exponentially. And then she created a system by which she could communicate that same data without having to go through all those tactile exercises using Braille. Meaning entered into her world. Context entered into her world, and the absurd behaviour that she once acted upon, she no longer had to do because she had a new way of communicating, a new way of understanding, and a new way of living her life. This is powerful. And when absurdity is in your world and everything's just absurd and ridiculous and pointless, then you act out. You do whatever you need to do to not feel absurd and ridiculous and pointless. And I think that's one of the biggest drivers for substance use. There's a disconnect from really sustainable meaning in our culture. and particularly for our young people. Anxiety and depression are exponentially growing in that demographic. And of course, they want to seek medication for that, don't they? Recalcitrant hedonism, not going to go into that today, but that's a growing sense of, hey, listen, I'm going to live for myself. I'm just going to party hard, do whatever. Ultimately, there's no meaning, so I just do what I want. I'm going to feel good going out. And that's a growing demographic as well.